there's only so much, right, that you can do. Okay. There's only so many people you can fuck and drinks you can drink and friends you can make and attention you can have, right? Like there's a point where it's just enough, okay? And because actually your shift into that means you are totally not looking after a side of yourself that also needs nurturing.
Whoa. Hey, welcome to Feedback Def. I'm Sabby RK, the apostate music journalist, and I am delighted to share this interview with Miki Berenyi, former frontwoman of the band Lush, also the band PIROSHKA, and now leader of the MB3 Miki Berenyi 3, or Miki Berenyi Trio. So, I was lucky enough to speak to Miki right before the American release or publication of this book, Fingers Crossed, How Music Saved Me from Success, her memoir, which was released in the UK on 9/8 Books in September of 2022, but is just seeing release in the States now via Mango Publishing. And we talked about it. I don't want to say too much about the book because she says a lot about it in the interview, but I will say this. Miki is very conversational, very funny, witty, sharp, curses a lot, very familiar, almost like some crude guy at the pub, like just lots of fucks and very frank, funny. But her writing style is really, really composed and very, very refined. And I think as a writer, I want to make sure that it doesn't get lost in the sort of enthusiasm around what she's saying about her time in the band Lush and her whole life story, that aspect of the book doesn't get lost. There's a lot in here that's quite shocking about her upbringing, but she is able to just unpack it in this way that is unflinching, but also really, really witty and always with a sense of humor. And as I mentioned in the interview, with a really forgiving eye towards people and an understanding. We talked about this, and you'll see that people are not entirely summable up by their mistakes and by their worst qualities. So there's a lot there. A bit about the band Lush, if you're not already familiar. So they came up in what is now referred to as like the shoegaze scene or dream pop, that whole uprising of bands in the UK in the late 80s and early 90s. And by the early 90s, they were they were sort of folded into the alternative wave. And by the very end of their career in 1996, they were starting to shift towards what was then starting to trend, which was more of a quote-unquote Britpop sound. But they did so reluctantly, and I think they did so with more flair than maybe... It wasn't just entirely like a calculated move to just put this new costume on. They did it in their own way. Boy, those early Lush records, especially the first three. So I consider there's an album that was released in the States named Gala on 4AD, the iconic record label. That was actually a collection of their first three EPs that they released in England. But I heard Gala first, and I heard it as a full record, so I always consider that their first album. And man, the way Miki and Emma Anderson from Lush intertwined their vocals, their harmonies. I mean, it's just so powerful. There's this one song, and I hope I don't get in trouble for singing this with YouTube. There's something goes, and sometimes I think if I tomorrow may bring. And then there's a part where they're together, they're like, ooh. And the way they played 12 string and like these rippling guitars together. I mean, it's I was 17 when I first heard them, 17, maybe 18. And I heard their proper full length, what I consider their second album, Spooky, whenever that was out, 91, 92. And, I was going on 20 years old. And you don't realize at that time in your life how profound of an imprint everything you're taking in is leaving on you. And so I mentioned this to Miki when I hear that. First of all, their music has aged really, really well. She talks about both in the book and in the interview and elsewhere in other interviews how they were sort of amateur musicians when they started, as a lot of bands are. They grew into their musical strengths as they went along, and by the time I saw them live, they were very gripping. And if you watch live clips of at least certain songs that have more of a sort of dramatic presence, they were really, really a force to be reckoned with. But I mentioned to her, hearing that, it's just like being just like yanked right back into the past, like 30 years, 35 years almost at this point. And it's like, wow. And, I think even for people who discovered them later in life, there's a lot there. It's not just nostalgia for me. It's not just like, oh, let's go back to late 80s, 90s nostalgia. Their music, to me, the more I listen to it, it just sounds stronger and more powerful. And I love that. There was a really interesting interpersonal dynamic, which we get into a little bit in the interview, and certainly she does in the book as well. I would highly, highly, highly recommend the book. Again, don't be fooled by how familiar and familial she is in conversation. That book is very, very, very well, and I was gonna say very, very well written, but it's beautifully crafted prose. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button and follow me on Substack, where I post a bunch of my other stuff as well. Enjoy.
Hey,
There we are.
fucking hell, every fucking time. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. It's actually a relief whenever this happens. So it's pretty funny. Hello.
Hello. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Just,
That's okay. I'm
I'm
not sure if they told you, but we've actually spoken once before for a PIROSHKA piece I did for Billboard a
okay.
few years back. And I also reviewed the Lush box set origami for Pitchfork in 2015, 16, 2016.
Yes, it would be then, wouldn't it? That was when the
Hmm.
reunion was, so it was around
Yes.
then.
It was right
Yeah.
around that time, either right before or right after.
Hmm.
So
I hope you gave
I
it a good review. I'm kidding.
you want to hear something hilarious? You want to hear something really funny and ridiculous? I don't write for Pitchfork anymore, so I can say this. So I don't remember what. So we have to submit scores for record, which I think is the most absurd thing. But I just do it as kind of a necessary evil, um, and they're down to like the decimal point. So I submitted my scores, and the editor there was at the time was a real sweetheart, and so I would submit my scores, and then they would kind of argue. They would then give me their suggestions on scores. They would always lower them. And then they'd be like, "Is that cool?" But it's not like I really had any say in changes. Like, here's our scores. Are you cool with that? But here's our scores. So they accidentally ran the ones I recommended, and they changed them. So if you go to the review now, it says at the bottom, correction. This review originally ran with some erroneous scores, which is just like, who
Oh
cares?
my, that's almost worse, isn't it? Like,
Totally.
because it gives the impression, I mean, I know how it works in terms of editorial bullshit like that, but it actually to a casual reader, it will be like, oh my God, did they listen to it more and then they didn't like it as much? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I wish I had archived the original scores, but whatever. It's not a big deal. And the scores never matched the actual content of the review, and it's just the nature of the beast. So I never concern myself too much with that. Um, so I bought your book last year and then thought I had gotten through most of it, and then to my horror, earlier this week realized you'll know how far I've gotten based on the questions. So then I was like madly cramming for the exam, kind of like, oh shit, like I've got much more to read. Uh, but you'll see, it'll be obvious. So I've got a lot of questions for you. Hopefully we can get through most of them. Thank you, by the way, and just go ahead and take the dive because there's a lot to talk about.
That's
Um,
fine. If we overrun, it's not a problem, by the
okay,
way,
great.
not for me anyway. So,
Okay, awesome, wonderful. So you were raised in a very hands-off way, at least when you were with your dad. And by today's standards, it's like, oh my God, to think about, how much, I guess you were given room, right, without supervision. And what is your thought, though, on how hands-on parents are today?
oh, way too much. Um, I think, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we know more. We know more about some of the dangers, which I think people didn't really know about then, or they just thought, oh, come on, that doesn't really happen, does it? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, so I can understand and certainly no one wants their child to have something really, really terrible happen to them. But I think the going so far the other way that children can't actually experience anything and have no freedom at all and can't learn anything for themselves, I think is just damaging in a completely other way. It's just very debilitating as an adult. I think it makes you quite incapable and stressed, as soon as you're faced with anything that you have to do yourself. And I do think a lot of I don't know, I can't make any sweeping generalizations and say this, that the massive explosion in mental health issues in young people is entirely down to that, but I can't help thinking that it's a part of it. Um, so while I would not in any way advocate that anyone bring up their children the way I was brought up, with quite that level of, because I think the problem with my dad in particular, as much fun as it was, it was quite selfish. Because he wanted to go out at night, it was like, well, I'm just going to bring her with me because I still want to fucking go out. You know what I mean? And I'm not going to let, having a kid stop me, which I think is too far, right?
Mhm.
You have to have responsibilities as a parent. But I do think that having confidence in your child to be able to go out there and navigate certain things, even if they are slightly beyond their years, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I wouldn't go out of my way to put my children in those sort of situations, but I do think that, you know, I think children are quite, wrapped in cotton wool. And again, mainly because the parents feel, I'm not sure how much of it is down to, some obviously it's down to protecting the child, but I think a lot of it is down to parents not wanting to be judged to be bad parents. And that in itself, I think, is not a great reason. You have, ultimately, you can never do anything 100% right as a parent. And I think that you can kind of, listen to your own voice and know, like kids walking to school. Do you know what? I listened to some podcast. I can't remember what the hell it was, but it was talking about in America how, you lot are way ahead of us with this sort of stuff, but how some children, some people will report some family to the police if they see some kid walking on their own to fucking school. Like, what the fuck? Right? That's insane.
Mhm.
Right? That is insane.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I heard a podcast recently where the interviewer asked the question, which I hadn't really thought about. It's like, well, Gen Xers, people who grew up in the 90s, were given tons of like hands off, were left alone a lot of the time, and were roaming the streets in packs with other kids. And those are the ones who are over hovering and was sort of getting into why would that be? Because there is a contrast there. I mean, how much of a challenge was it for you to find a balance between, because as parents we all say, okay, there's certain things I'm not going to do like my parents, but then there's things where you look in the mirror and you're like, fuck, I am my parents. Like, right? You
No
just find
shit.
yourself. What kind of internal conversation or struggle did you have yourself?
I mean, yeah, I think, oh God, it's tricky, isn't it? Because it was tricky at the time. I would make these decisions and then worry that I'd, you know, maybe expected my too much from my kids, or yeah, there's that terrible moment where you kind of can hear your own voice and think, oh, I recognize that. That's my dad. How terrifying is that? But I do, and I know that there are terrible examples of people who will look. I know people who have done things like they sent their kids off to boarding school at the age of 7, right? That's
Mm,
not abusive. Loads of people think that's a fucking great idea. To me, it's appalling, right?
hmm
But they're thinking, well, I went to boarding school and it made a man of me, right? And you can remind them that, yeah, but you always used to talk about boarding school, that it was a fucking nightmare and you hated
hmm
it and you missed your parents. And they'll go, yeah, 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 but I got through it and it made me a better person. And schools were different back then anyway, right? So, I mean, it's always really difficult because you're going to kind of, I think all of it is well intentioned. All parents want the absolute best for their children. It's just that none of us know what that is or what it looks like, really. It just comes down to there's no guidebook. Well, there's a million guidebooks, but they all say different bloody things, right? So you end up just having to rely on your own judgment and talk about it with the other parent and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? So I think that there I think even when it came to like, bullying at school, which is inevitable, right? It's just going to happen at some point. And I do remember thinking, now, do I do what my parents didn't do, which is fly into the school and go absolutely fucking crazy, which is almost the thing I wished they had done when I was a kid.
hmm
But then I didn't know what the repercussions of that would be, because I remember thinking, well, if I do this, I'm going to be the difficult mother, right? And and I think often, so I did, by the way, just to clarify, I did go into the school, but I kept really cool about it. And I was like, look, I know that child may have some problems. I don't want to, I'm not asking them to be punished. I'm just asking for some whatever. But all of these took a little balancing because my instinct would be to be protective and to, you know, fix problems, which is what everybody wants to do with their children, but sometimes they have to fix them themselves. And it's really, really hard to know when that is. So I think, yeah, possibly, things like even, you know, I mean, I remember like, I'm not going to say which because they get really pissed off if I talk about them. But the point is one of them came back with alcohol once, but hidden, right? And they were quite young. Not I mean, I was drinking by that age and so was Moose, right? So there was a bit of me that was like, I don't really have a leg to stand on here, but we are going to have a word. Um, whereas something like drugs, I had absolutely no problem going, like total no, because I never had that in my life. Drugs were just not a part of it. So I know parents who fucking smoke weed in front of their kids and have done cocaine and stuff like that, which to me is like absolutely no fucking way, right? But a bit of booze, I'm like, well, as long as they're not fucking going crazy, you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? It's
Sure,
difficult.
sure. No, and there's so many things like this where it's like, well, if you give them some autonomy and give them some credit. Because I remember being like 12, I was given a lot of room I grew up in New York City. I don't live there anymore, but I mean, I was taking the what you guys call the tube at like 9 by myself. Now there were like 500 other kids on the same sub station as me, but I just remember having so much autonomy, and it's like, well, and the music I listened to, I mean, my mom would occasionally be like, look at something, and you could see the gears turning in her head. Do I say something? Nah, I'm just gonna, you know. I don't think it was so much giving me credit as much as she just didn't want to deal with it. But if you give kids some sense, all right, look, I can trust you to a certain degree, I think you get better results than, oh my God, you're an infant and you need to be bubble wrapped with everything. And like, yeah, and like I know in some cultures the kids are drinking at the table wine with their parents, and it's not a, and then they don't go off to college and have like blackouts, right? Because
I mean,
that it's
that's a good, because I can remember that even at the time. Actually, I remember this girl, she was actually a friend of Emma's, and I remember she was so like kind of, I think she had to like climb out of a window once to come to a party that I had, and she would go fucking crazy. Right. I remember once we didn't know where she'd gone. She'd gone off with some guy, and we were like trying to find her because we had to get her back before her parents woke up, and get her back through the window. It was absolutely insane. But she would just, because she had no freedom whatsoever, the second she did, she would go completely fucking crazy. And I think I always have that in my mind. So, it's a difficult balance. I definitely didn't go whole hog the other way, which I can understand. I mean, at the end of the day, you want your children, right, to have the good experiences you had as a kid as well. And a lot of that is freedom. I mean, yeah, I traveled on the tube when I was like 9 years old as well. And my kid, to be honest, my kids did.
mm.
I encouraged them to go out in London when they were quite young. I mean, not as young as that, but probably like 12, 13. Go for it. Go to the swimming baths, go on your own. In fact, Stella used to get the tube because she was going to school, a tube ride away or a bus ride away. I mean, it's London. You cannot expect to be walked everywhere in London. It's built for people to navigate around without a car on their own. It's made easy for you, as long as it's not bloody, 1 o'clock in the morning, you'll be fine. And why deny yourself that kind of amazing experience? That I can still remember being a kid and going to the Disney cinema in St. Martin's Lane when I was like 10 on my own with a friend. And it was really exciting because you felt like you kind of owned the city a bit. Like, look at us going off on our own to the cinema. It's a great feelings to have.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, totally, totally. And I mean, you didn't seem uncomfortable at all in your role as like the mouthpiece of this rock band. And I remember seeing interviews, and I looked at some on YouTube. I don't know, you know, I don't know what was internally going on, but you seemed very at ease with attention, and I wonder how much of a sense you had that the world was your oyster, literally going from country to country in Lush. And I wonder how much of that is a result of the way you were brought up.
Um, I mean, I don't know how comfortable I did feel being the, mouthpiece, as you put it, not least because I was always very conscious that it was a band, and that idea of one person's opinion being, when actually, we all four of us were, very different people and had our own, voice, as it were. Um, so I think there was always a feeling of, making sure that everybody got room to kind of give their opinion. And that was sometimes difficult because obviously, a lot of interviews and stuff, they just say, whatever, just answer the question so I've got something to write. They don't want a kind of whole debate about it. Like, and then that could become difficult because then, 9 times out of 10, they put down what the bloody lead singer says, and then everybody else is a bit miffed because their opinion doesn't get in there. So, all of these things have these sorts of internal conflicts. I think that I didn't, yeah, I mean, I think I I was confident in the way, in one aspect, because I was probably quite precocious as a child. You know, I hung around a lot with adults, so I was used to talking to, you know, grown-ups or whatever. But I don't think I had an immense amount of self-confidence. I was very frightened of being judged
Hmm.
and not very good at taking criticism, you know, especially because so much of it would be personal, you know.
Yeah, see, that's interesting because that doesn't line up with what, like I said, what appears on the surface. There was one interview. It's not on YouTube anymore. I had a hard time finding it. It's towards the end. It's where it's around love life, and I don't know whether you were just in a mood that day, but there's a kind of weariness that seemed to have settled in, and everybody knows the British press are very gossip columny and turn on bands very quickly, much more so than in the States. And that's maybe the only time I had ever seen something like discomfort shown. So I wish I could find the clip still, because you just seemed like you were like kind
I
of
wonder
done with
what
it.
was it on? Do you know what? Can you remember what who was in the interview, or
It
what
was a
was it, a
British
telly program?
show. It was a British show, and I don't know why, but you were being interviewed outdoors. I don't know if it was a junkyard or something. There was something in the background, and it had the Britpop thing had already started, and so it just seemed you didn't seem to be relishing it as much as maybe in the past. Um, and it might have been morning. I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, I suspect, you know, without I can't. I know there's one or two interviews I can remember doing that really pissed me off, but I don't, you know, without seeing it, I wouldn't know. But you know, because of Britpop, you know, you suddenly had this sort of explosion of kind of TV programs and things like that, you know, that would interview. You know, prior to that, if we did like 120 minutes or whatever in America, these were people who actually knew about fucking music, right, and knew about your music. Whereas quite often with these sort of, you know, slightly more wacky TV programs, you've just got a presenter. I mean, it's not really their fault, but you've got a presenter who's just there to kind of be, you know, it's more about them than it is about you. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not really someone who wanted to play that game. I mean, I've had radio interviews like that where someone's asking you questions, no, I'm fucking looking at you, you know what I mean? And that all the questions are really asinine. And you're like, well, if you're not even going to engage with me, like, I don't mind being silly and irreverent or whatever, but there has to be some sort of rapport and understanding. Whereas, you know, you just feel like, well, we could be anyone. Some of those interviews, it's like, yeah, what's your name again? You know, oh yeah, they're just looking at a sheet. Yeah, Mickey. Oh, which one's Mickey? All right, okay. Yeah, do you know what I mean? And you just think like, well, fuck me, you know. So, and I think that was more prevalent during that Britpop era, just because it was, you know, because that music was more popular and it was in the charts. So you didn't have these sort of niche interviewers who were actually kind of clued up and knew what they were doing. They were just sort of, you were just a, you know, interview number 1047. So, and, you know, I just probably did get quite tired of that.
Yeah, that sparks a question I had only ever thought of unconsciously. This has never actually crystallized till just now. So I hate that in America there's this like morning zoo kind of radio thing where you've got three radio people and they're all trying to be funny and quip a lot, and they'll interrupt the interview subject. It's like, oh my God, let the person talk. But then there's the equivalent of that in Britain too. Did that start here? Is that British DJs taking after an American style thing, or is that just a thing that started in both places?
I don't really know, you know. Um, I mean, I know what you mean. I can't really think of where I would have first seen that on, like, you know, a public broadcasting. I've seen it in, do you know what? I have this memory of going to the pub. It was probably about 94 or something. And I just remember sitting in this pub with like about five or six journalists I was with John, who was a PR, so it was just a social drink, and these people were, and I thought, God, you lot are colleagues. No one's listening to anyone. They're just lining up their next quip, and I just thought it was quite depressing. And I've seen, I can't really bear, like, I listen to quite a lot of podcasts, but there's a lot I can't listen to because it's all people talking over each other and they're not listening to each other. So I've never liked it. I went to a talk the other day. I'm not going to say who it was, but it was, kind of book type thing. And fuck me, the bloke was just I can't even remember what the subject of the bloody talk was meant to be because it was nothing about it. It was just him telling a load of anecdotes about himself and what a crazy guy he was. You know what I mean? And I just thought, oh my God, this is so fucking boring. So yeah, I think it's just um but I think in like kind of light-hearted, like youth TV, I mean, there's a patronizing quality to that, isn't there? Which I think, was very 90s. I think youth kind of music TV programming in the kind of 80s when I was growing up, particularly for sort of alternative stuff. I don't know, it was actually a bit more informed and oh, that's quite interesting and all of that. And I think when it got into the 90s, it was much more sort of, hey everyone, we've got blah 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 here. Anyway, so what have you been up? So you've got a new album out. Yeah. So when are you going on to, it's just like whatever, just, I might as well just hold up a list of dates and show the album and then I'll just fuck off out of here because like there's no depth whatsoever to this, which I think is patronizing to an audience because it's assuming that the audience hasn't got the mental capacity to stay tuned for long enough to hear something that they're not actually expecting or might not know the answer to, apart from just basic information. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that I mean, there's a lot that we can say that is, there's a lot to be said for criticizing where we are in our relationships with communication. But one of the things that I find very encouraging is that there's clearly an appetite for more now. There's, yes, people like a lot of superficial, silly shit, but podcasts and everything. I mean, clearly people have a hunger for more of a relating kind of interaction, and I think that's great. I'm, put that in
I
the
mean, they
wind.
do, but do you not think that they also have a hunger for things that they already agree with? That's my only issue with this is that it's, you know, most people will listen to stuff that they like the host. I mean, there's some great shows because you get people who will get like different kinds of people on, but there's an awful lot of things where I think, my God, you're really preaching to this one audience and it's not really stretching me in any direction. So I last a couple of episodes and I just think I don't really need, I know all this already. And I think I kind of, what does disappoint me a bit about the sort of, modern communication is it, I mean, I think that does come from America because I think we used to have, when I first went to America, that idea of having a radio station that is only for this kind of music, right? This is 50s, whatever. This is like easy listening. This is like heavy metal. I mean, and they were all kind of split up. And we never really had that. And although we had like newspapers that catered to left or right wing, right? The I mean, I have to say that the left wing press now are almost as bad as the right wing. Like, I just can't trust the news anymore because it just leaves out whole swathes of things where I think you've left that out because you know your audience won't like it. Well, that's not fucking news, you know what I mean? And
Yes, I do. Totally. Oh no, that is a massive, massive problem. Um, I guess so. Yes, absolutely. And as someone who grew up leftist, I'm appalled actually at what this hideous mutation, um, and you've got people who are like almost, they're like playing into each other's blind spots, right? So like one side of the conversation exaggerates and says something horrendous, and then the other side latches onto that, and you've got people kind of hitting each other over the head, and they're talking past each other, and they can't hear one another at all. Huge problem. What I'm seeing though is a trend, tiny bit more and more and more, where fans of shows, of podcasts and YouTube channels will challenge the host and they'll engage and they're still fans, right? But they'll be like, "Well, actually I think you're missing the nuance here." And I never used to see that before. I used to
Oh,
just see
really?
garbage on comment sections. It was like awful. Um, Now I'm seeing more, so I feel like something is growing. I think people need to relearn how to engage with an idea that is not palatable to us. And I think left and right are both equally. Nobody at this point wants to face something that they're uncomfortable with. They're like, nope, get it out of here. No. It's just too easy to just be like, no, 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 no. I don't even want to see it. Um, so we're
But that does come from the originator as well, and I think, I mean, it's quite symbiotic because I think people think, it's that kind of, since social media, it's that kind of, you know, likes, getting more likes. And if you dare say anything, that's slightly challenging, people might kind of, veer away or throw a load of abuse at you. You know what I mean? But a journalist or, an organization in particular, shouldn't be doing that. I mean, especially when it comes to just not reporting certain facts. Well, those facts don't align with my views, so I'm just not going to mention them, even though I fucking know them, right? I mean, that's insane. Like, that is the whole point of being a journalist. And
Yes, and that's a humongous, at least here, and I can hear it too. It like I've just coming across British media. It's the whole business, the whole model. Everyone is doing that in that structure. Um, they're just completely like it's like they've got one blind spot, right? Like they've got like or a pair of glasses with one eye covered, or an eye patch or something, and they're doing it on purpose. It's really scary. I just think eventually things will kind of correct themselves, I think,
I mean, I
somehow.
think, I mean, maybe, you see, I think, right, when I was growing up, my dad was Hungarian, we would go to Hungary, so I would kind of see that, not, I mean, I would just witness some of that kind of what it was like to be under that kind of Soviet occupation.
You mentioned that
But
in the
clearly,
book.
yeah, and in London, obviously Thatcher was in, everyone, in those youth culture groups was very anti-Thatcher and therefore very left-wing and blah, blah, blah. But then that,
Glamorizing Soviet style or Cuban style communism and the like they had this romantic ideal of that.
yes,
Yeah.
totally, right. And the irony is that when I look, that was the whole point of that fucking Soviet propaganda, right? It was just as bad as the right-wing tabloids that you might get in the West, in that it, just completely exaggerated Western kind of, decay and whatever, and didn't report on any of its own, ideological problematic issues, nothing, it's totally one-sided. Well, it was propaganda. And, I think I can see that creep, coming in. So it's not really about left wing and right wing. It's just about, shit fucking thinking and authoritarianism. And I do think that, I did my best without sounding too grand here, right? But when I was writing the book, there are, all sorts of people I wanted to write about because they were part of my history or part of, the band's history. And even like people who I just fucking couldn't stand, okay, who I would literally, if I talked about, would think of them as like really problematic. Um, I had to try and balance that with something good about them because people aren't just all bad or all good. And also, there were people that we worked with. Well, we chose to work with them. If they were that fucking bad, why the hell did you get them to be your manager? Or why the hell did you go out with them? Or whatever the fuck you did with them? There must have been something good about them. Otherwise, you would never have even associated with them. And I think even with my grandmother, who is, it's difficult with Nora because I didn't know her until she was already fucking crazy. But I still think, it, she must have had, a decent side to her somewhere when she was younger. You know what I mean? God knows what happened to her to make her into that person. So, and I just think, with the book, I was never, wanting to write that book as some sort of, right, this is where I get to kind of glorify myself and all my achievements and make anyone who stood in my way or was problematic, I can finally get my own back and paint them as these terrible people. And I didn't want to do that, not least because it's actually really fucking boring for the reader, right? Because you
Well,
can, as a reader, you can see through that. You can see that that's bullshit. You can't be the only fucking great person, you know what I mean, in your memoir.
Well, but that would be rewarded. Now, this is part of what we were talking about a moment ago. So I wrote. I'm just going to read to you this question that I had. The way you describe people in the book is both unflinching and sympathetic to how they turned out the way they did. It doesn't read like the sentiments of someone who's consumed by anger, um, and it's out of step with the current tone of vilifying people as all bad. That I think does get rewarded a lot. And I've even watched some interviews with you where people kind of can't, they can only interpret what you're describing through that kind of lens, right? They're like bad abusers. And whereas you're painting pictures of your family members, even Nora, there's the picture, right? Where you're like, oh man, when she was in her 20s or whatever, there was some life, or I don't remember what the caption, something like that. Like, where it's like, wow, there was a person in here right before she became bitter. And I think the book sidesteps the way you write, sidesteps this Puritanism that also started here, where I mean, we're just so like the last 10 years, it's like we're going to hang you out to dry, we're going to crucify you in public and burn you at the stake basically because you are bad, whatever, from whatever political side it comes. So I thought the book was like a discreet alternative to that.
Yeah. And, that is how I think as well. I'm a terrible both sides kind of, I always remember thinking that the character I most deeply identified with was Charlie Brown because it's always a kind of, yeah, but you like to the point where you can become quite ineffective, you know. I mean, look, I have my sort of strident moments and I will go on a rant, but I do think that, even when people are having political discussions, I will be the person who goes, well, you can't say everyone who voted for Brexit is a fucking racist. I mean, that's ridiculous. And I do find myself, I actually do want to hear from the Trump voters who aren't completely, conspiracy theoried up to the wazoo, right? But there must be normal people, right, who voted for Trump, clearly, right? And I'm interested in hearing those sort of people's opinions. I don't think they're right, but I would like to know that a sane person's, someone who isn't so terrified that they believe every ludicrous thing about his worldview. But I would like to know why someone feels that way because I'm sure they have their reasons. I know people who voted for Brexit and I know their reasons. I don't agree with them, but I do think, okay, I can see you've got a point there. And ultimately, I mean, you could be proven right. I can't predict that. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
But I do think unless you know all the facts, unless you've thought about all the different permutations, how do you know you're making the right decision? This idea that, well, you make the right decision because you're a good person. Well, that's ridiculous. That's crazy.
It's
You
dangerous
know, I
too because it has a religiosic um thrust to it. It's like whether people are religious or not, they feel emboldened by the sense that they're on a crusade and they can disparage and dehumanize people that don't agree with them. What you're looking for is, it sounds like you're looking for what you can relate to in a person who makes a decision or sees things differently, whereas this all or nothing, fuck you if you don't agree approach is not looking for that. It's looking to make people faceless, and that's scary because it means it justifies a lot of anger towards other people that is not good. I'm curious. Your dad supported Thatcher and Reagan, and you can see why people from communist regimes do that, right? Like, um, where do you think he would have stood on Brexit?
I think he would have thought Brexit was ridiculous. Um, it's difficult because I think around the time that he died and he was sort of already getting a bit, I have no doubt that he would have loved Trump, unfortunately, because he was already quite into Orban in Hungary. Now, whether that would have tipped once Orban is getting a bit cozy with Putin, because my dad had just a lifelong, that was never going to change, distrust of the Russian Empire. Not against Russians individually. He, had a lot of friends out there, but in terms of, politically, there's no way I think that he could have squared someone like Putin, who is, after all, part of the old regime as well. Um, he didn't even trust Gorbachev, so
Mm.
I think, but yeah, so it would be difficult to see where he would have gone with that. I think that Brexit he would have thought was ludicrous just because he was a European, he absolutely, that just selfishly probably would have thought, well, that's crazy that you're going to have to, get a fucking work permit to go to Europe when we've had Schengen. Well, we never had Schengen, but you know what I mean. You could move freely around Europe, and now you're going to put up all these fucking walls. He would have been pissed off because it would have directly impacted him as well, right? So I think so. Yeah, interesting. I mean, he was always quite maverick with those things. He was quite, like I say, very into Thatcher, very into Reagan, but at the same time, far more supportive, for instance, of a united Ireland than of like Northern Ireland. Um, Absolutely loathed the kind of, you know, DUP type, whatever they were back then. Um, the kind of pro-British, Northern Irish, whatever. Thought that I don't know, there was a kind of underdog thing that I think he would support. Um, I don't know. Yeah, I think his politics were actually completely based on his own experience and not necessarily. I mean, he would never have joined a political party, like not at all.
Mm.
Um, but he did absolutely loathe Labour. But again, because I think he felt that it was creeping towards, anti-American and pro-Russian.
Mm.
Um, But, as I put in the book, I can remember sitting there with him and going like, well, so you think education should be free? You
He's like,
think
yes.
that,
He's like, of course,
yeah. And he was
right?
like, well,
Yeah.
obviously, of course, health should be free. Of course, this, that, and the other. And I was like,
And you're like,
well,
well, that's
that's
left wing
like,
in Britain.
that's
That's
left
left,
wing.
yeah, in Britain. Yeah, 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 yeah.
But,
It's
no, I was just going to say, all of those things are so subjective and different in each country as well, aren't they? You can be kind of, I've met people who are, left or certainly were back then when I think of like the difference between being an American and left wing and being British and left wing in say the 90s. two very, very different things. There wasn't people kind of a bit more allied now because I think you've got social media and it's very global and the conversations are constantly back and forth. But back then, America did feel like a very different country. And the idea, I mean, I think a lot of Americans still struggle with the idea of free healthcare, you
Oh,
know.
sure, sure, sure. Yes, because these issues are framed differently in different countries, and also now between generations they're framed differently, which is why they're so hard to talk about. Um, yeah, yes, there's so much there, and so many dissonant inconsistencies. Where you've got like just an example here, you've got left-wing people who are very into sort of body autonomy and not wanting social rules to dictate or religious values or family values or whatever. But then they're very quick to want government to impose rules and restrictions. Then in reverse, you've got a similar kind of dissonance on the right where, you know, they want freedom from government, but then, they want the states to be able to decide whether, your reproductive rights and everything. It's all very jumbled. And people are not capable of assessing where their own inconsistencies are usually. Well, they're capable, but it takes something to nudge you into being able to do that, unless you're a both sides-ish thinker, which is a dirty word now. People say you're both sidesing, and they're very pissed about it. Like it's a slur almost, to like, as if you don't have conviction and you. I wonder in your case how much being ethnically mixed might have anything to do. I have always felt that this is a vantage point because you can see groups for what they are from a distance in a way that other people can't. That's so I'm curious how that's been for you.
Um, yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because I think, it's that, I mean, it's just such a kind of well-worn thing, but I do remember sort of, people kind of going, oh, you're Hungarian or you're Japanese or, you're they expect you to know about both of these cultures when you're like, 9 or something and going around to someone's house, someone's parents' house, and they're like, oh, yes, Japanese art and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you fucking know way more about this than I do, right? Like, I may be Japanese, like in terms of, the physical makeup, but all I know is like Hello Kitty and the stuff that interests me. I'm not culturally embedded there. And the same goes for Hungary. And I think that, I'd be an outsider there as well, you know. And I think that I don't know, I think it's I mean, as a kid, all you want to do is fit in, right? So anything that makes you different is a fucking pain in the ass, and it's hurtful, you feel like you're not. I mean, I remember once actually there was a thing at school where people were told to bring baby pictures in because they were going to play a game of guess who's the person who the baby is. And it was like, well, this is a bit fucking obvious, isn't it? I haven't
Right.
really factored in the, racial kind of, the fact that I'm the only fucking Oriental in the whole class. Like, but and it was harmless and it was funny, but there's always these little reminders that you're kind of, everybody else is one group and you're not, and sometimes that feels like, upsetting and rejecting. But I think that all of the things that I mean, this is another thing about children not necessarily knowing what's good for them, because although that might be a kind of, oh, I wish my parents had done this and I wish my parents had done that so I didn't have to go through this bit of discomfort. Well, lo and behold, when you get older, those things will be a benefit to you. That ability to be able to see, have a little bit more objectivity, to not always feel that you take it for granted that you're always part of a tribe, because, so all of those things actually are quite, I think, assets. Other people have to go and travel for like, go off and find themselves, and you've kind of done half the work already because you just experienced it in your daily life, really. That I think what was interesting about, Japan in particular is that I think it's, it's quite a sexist culture. It's not, it's sort of, when people would, I know women who love going to Japan. They're, oh, I'd love to live in Japan and blah, blah, blah. And you think, I know, but that you probably think that because partly you're not Japanese, so you do get treated slightly differently, in terms of work and things like that. I'm assuming, but certainly my experience of going to Japan, where the kind of, the roles are very clearly demarcated, and doesn't appeal to me whatsoever. Like it's a brilliant country, but yeah, that was a problem for me. And I think sometimes I could see that, what you'd get is other people's opinion. Either I would, people are ignorant in two different ways. So you'd either get these kind of guys who are like, oh, I love Japanese women, because they think it's like fucking Shogun or something. And it's like, there's going to be like geisha girls everywhere. But equally, people who see it as that kind of, I don't know, like a bit sleazy. I always used to get that kind of thing of like, oh, isn't Japan where they get like vending machines with like schoolgirls use knickers in it? And, it's like, oh, like it's sort of a bit pedo, isn't it? And whatever. And I think, okay, but you are picking on some real extremes here.
Well, a
Like
friend of
if you
mine
want,
sold her underwear for 1,000. No, it might have even been 1,500 American dollars. She put her underwear in a vending machine while she was visiting there.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm gonna be gross, but you could like, it was like a la carte. You could order them with menstrual stains and shit stains in the underwear. This is what she told me. And I was like, whoa, that I didn't know. I knew about the vending machines. I didn't realize it was so, but yeah. So for whatever that's worth, uh, that
Yikes.
was her experience, and she said, yeah, she made that much money, but I mean, yeah, yikes! It's like what is it that's feeding that appetite? Probably being so um, reserved of a culture, right? Like where everything is so regimented that then creates this whole other impulse to do also. And even the manga there is with kids or teenagers are reading, it's like you look at this and you're like, whoa, that stuff is extreme, right? So
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, isn't it? I think it is clearly quite a repressive society and incredibly rule bound. The one like, it's like, but again, it's like everything. You've got the best and the worst. I think crime. And when I first went there with Moose, he fucking loved Japan. He was like, oh my God, because he was so used to in Britain, before you go into a pub, you'd have to sort of scope it out, he felt, because he was like, oh, if it's like a certain football team's fans, or if it's this, or if it's got a dodgy vibe, no, we're not going in there. You know what I mean? In Japan, there's none of that. You go in, you go wherever, there's no threat of that kind of stuff. Near where my grandparents lived, there was this sort of underpass area. There must have been about 2,000 bicycles there from people who would, cycle up to the station and then commute into work. None of them are locked up, right?
mhm.
None of them. You just, oh my God, it would last 5 seconds in London. Vending machines, not with the underwear, but vending machines with like cigarettes, sake, beer, totally unvandalized.
Yeah,
Absolutely
right,
unbelievable.
right.
But at the same time, I took my fucking kids swimming and it was like, oh my, you have to have this, they have to wear this sort of swimming thing. You have to have a swimming hat. You have to put your shoes here. You have to wash your feet here. You can't read a book. You can't swim this way. You can't go in through the side. I mean, my God, you know what I mean?
Well,
Like,
you can't even be loud. I've never been to Japan, but a good friend of mine, her brother lives there and is married and has a child, and they're raising a child there. And it's frowned on to even be loud speaking. I'm not talking about boom, bumping, bass music out of your car in their neighborhood past a certain hour. It's like not okay. So even that, I mean, right. So it's like, well, pick your poison, right? Which which is going to wear you down the most? The death by a thousand cuts of control,
yeah,
or right, yeah, or being beaten up by some soccer hooligans. Right,
exactly.
right.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to ask you about your dad a little bit, just a little bit more.
Sure.
Um, There's a section in the book where you're you're road tripping with your dad and his mom, Nora, your grandmother, across Europe to Hungary, and he stops and has you both wait in the car for hours while he goes upstairs to the apartment of a woman he knows from his past, let's put it that way. And then he comes back in the car and he's like really graphic and detailed about that encounter in a way that is like, at least to Americans and Brits, is like totally shocking, even like horrifying. Um, but throughout the book, you express a lot of warmth towards your dad as well. Not much. I didn't get much of a sense of like blame or even um, what's the word? Recrimination, condemnation of your dad much at all. And I wonder how much people have tried to kind of wedge what you're saying into this language of abuse that we use today. I wonder how much they've sort of like struggled with like, oh, well, she's not putting her dad in like this column over here.
Um, I mean, a bit. I think that I mean, most people kind of get the warmth. They get that he was a, you know, that he had a kind of, a very good side to him, actually, a very gregarious side to him. Um, and, and key to that is, I think, without wishing to contrast him particularly with Ray, my stepdad, Ray was someone who had had one relationship after the other, as my dad had, but he'd fathered shitloads of fucking children, right? And in each situation, abandoned them and then moved on and had more children and then moved on again. And I think I always felt that whatever my dad had, whatever his failings, he had stuck with me. He had fought to keep me in his life, which I think was, made me forgive a lot, actually, because I could see how lots of men in the 70s, it was almost acceptable to do that. Well, he's remarried, it didn't work out, he's got a new family now. You didn't even get that much social condemnation for that. You would from
Mm.
some people, but generally people would go, well, he's a man, he's got a new family, whatever. And my dad felt that was appalling, you know. He thought that was terrible. And it may be because his own father had fucked off, and didn't want to know him. So I think he did have, however maverick it was, he did have a moral compass. It just didn't align with most people's. And I do think that, he couldn't pass by the, you know, yes, it's selfish. It is quite entertaining as well. Like he could be quite very funny, and he just couldn't shut himself up when he wanted to share a good anecdote or some fucking observation. Like the fact that there's a 9-year-old child in the room isn't going to stop him. Okay. And when I became like, a little bit older, by the time I was like 12 or 13, I would be telling him to just fucking shut up, right? I remember him actually, God, I was about 16 when I lived in that flat in Notting Hill. And he turned up because I said, "Oh, I'm having a party." And he turned up with a bottle of Cinzano or something. And the first thing he said, he looked at my mate Melissa and went, "Oh, who's that?" And I was like, "Right, that's it. Leave. Go. That's it. You're gone." I thought, "No, I'm not dealing with this. So you can fuck off." But, he just didn't have any boundaries, you know.
Mm.
And he didn't kick off. I did kick him out of the party. I did keep the bottle of Cinzano, but it's not like he took massive offense and never spoke to me or whatever. He just was like, "Oh, he was like, come on, you fucking asshole. What's wrong with you? I'm just enjoying myself." And I'd be like, "Nope, not here." So I would have to enforce the boundaries. Right.
Well, and to be clear, in the book, he's talking to his mother. That,
Yeah.
that anecdote where he was talking about all the details and how loose she was and everything, the lady in the apartment. He's talking more to his mom than he is to you. You just happen to be there, right? He's not
No, he's
really.
talking to me as well.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay.
Totally talking to me as well. There was no off switch with Ivan, especially with things like that. He was just totally indiscreet. Now, I'm not going to lie, I have inherited some of that. And it's arguable that, some of the book where people go, "Oh, it's so honest and it's so this." And I think, well, that is kind of how I talk, right? And there are times when maybe I shouldn't. That it's like, can you just, I mean, I have my kids going, "Do not talk about me in any interviews," right?
Right, right. So I was going to ask you, and what were your discussions like with them after this book was out or while you were writing it? How much was that an issue for them to discover things about you? I don't know how much they already knew, but
No, I
there's,
mean,
I
I
mean,
told
there's,
them both not to read it.
oh, okay. Because there's
Oh
some
yeah,
things in
no,
there
I
that are quite extremely heavy.
I mean, they are, but they're grown up. I mean, they're 20, 23 nearly and 19. But I was
Well, I
just
mean,
like, no, don't.
I
Sorry,
mean,
go
for
on.
anybody to read about their mom, regardless of your age, right?
Well,
It'd
that's
be
what I
like,
mean.
yeah, yeah.
That's what I mean. Because I was like, "I'm your mom. It's just going to feel weird. You don't need to read that stuff." I, I mean, I'm happy to talk about it if they ask me about it. You know, um, I've been sort of, there's certain issues that I've been relatively open about, but yeah, I get it. There's some things you just don't want to hear about your parents. It's just a bit yucky,
So, to your awareness, how faithful were they to your request not to read it?
I have no idea because in a way, I mean, if either of them said that they had and they wanted to talk to me about it, I'd go fine, but I'm not going to pester them for detail. Have you read it? Have you? I'm just not going to ask. It's up to them.
Mm, mm. Last question on that subject, because so Lush did that Lady Killers video. You've talked about that, the Chili Peppers, and touring with all these guy bands in '92, Lollapalooza. But from your understanding, since your dad uh, went through all these women, what do you think it is from your perspective that drives that? And I'll qualify that by saying I think men should be honest and understand that if they had the opportunity, maybe not all men would pursue that, but if it was there, because your dad was essentially a rock star without the rock or the celebrity, but it wasn't like he had to go out of his way, right? It seemed like it was just available to him. Um, I feel like most 99%, it would take an enormous amount of self-control not to at least dabble in that kind of thing. And I think a lot of men would realize it's doesn't feel good or something. But I'm just curious, what is it you think that creates that? And why are women drawn to that sometimes?
Um, I mean, I think that there is a different sex drive for a start, I think, with men and women generally. That's not to say they don't, there's like isn't a crossover period or portion. But I do think that, you know, at the end of the day, even I think like, my dad would sometimes talk about it actually and go on about, shagging around, but actually how sometimes he really wanted to, be in love and, and wanted to settle. And he was forever talking about, oh, I wish I'd have had 5 children or 6 children. I was like, well, you were never with anyone for fucking long enough. Well, I would have settled down eventually, blah, blah, blah. But, as soon as something came along, you know what I mean? He just couldn't say no. Now, some of that I do think was down to the fact that he was abused as well. And I think that there is something to that, that at an age at which you are far too young to be able to make any kind of rational sort of judgment on what is actually happening, it kind of makes sex into something that it is transactional and doesn't really come from you. It's something that's kind of done to you or groomed out of you or coaxed out of you, but it's not particularly, you're just not developed enough to know what's going on. And once it's happened, it kind of embeds itself in how you relate to that. And I do think some of my dad's promiscuity, because he did tell me that when he didn't tell me in massive detail, but he basically implied that his mate, when he'd got married when he was very young in Hungary, and then when he left Hungary in 56 and kind of escaped the regime, he went kind of, you know, around Europe, with his mate Gabby, and they were, bunking onto trains and having their high times. And he said, Gabby saved my life. He made me go out there and, well, as my dad would put it, hunt pussy, right? But it almost sounds like he had like, he was quite fucked up, and that Gabby's way of kind of like, curing him was to just throw him into like just sex whenever possible and just fucking get on with it and get over it. And I guess it worked, but he just didn't have any self-control over it. And I think that the only reason I say that I think maybe some of that was to do with his, the abuse that he suffered, is because I do actually think that's the way that I was. I think that I was very promiscuous. I don't really know what I was looking for. It's just that sex was very easy because you've already kind of crossed that bridge. Do you know what I mean? I'd be slightly mystified by girls around me who were like, oh, it has to be special or it has to be this. And you think, really? Because most of the time it fucking isn't, right? Like, if it's special, that's great. That happens rarely, but most of it's just, because that was my experience. And, I don't, by the way, I'm not for a second advocating. That's like, it's not a great way to be. But at the same time, I do think even growing up around my dad, some of that kind of lady killer stuff. I mean, I used to see women falling for that crap all the time. And I think, my God, can you not see through this? Because I've actually been the person who is I'm watching my dad using those lines. I know how this fucking works. How can you be so naive that if some guy walks up to you and says, like, oh yeah, I've always really been attracted to you. Actually, didn't have the courage to tell you before, but I've always really fancied you. And it's like, come on, give me a fucking break. No, you just want to fuck me right now, is what you mean. You're not holding a candle to me. I get it. But I think, and I think another reason for men to do that is because it's socially accepted. It's, hey, you're a stud, of course. It's like, the romantic hero, even if you're not that crude about it, it's the romantic hero who leaves broken hearts at every port, you know what I mean? And He can't
Yes.
be pinned down. He's the untamable. He's the world traveler. He's got bigger things, bigger fish to fry. And if you happen to kind of, if you waft through your bed at any time, you'll be forever smitten. It's a load of bollocks, right? But culturally, I think these are the sort of fantasies that we're fed. Um,
And
I mean, Christ.
those books sell a lot.
They do, and I think that there is, I mean, God knows there's probably a billion feminist tracks have been written about all of this stuff. So, and far more eloquently than I can put it. I think, that it starts with a kernel of, yes, I do think that, men women have more of the settling down gene. It's not that they don't have a sex drive or that they're just, passively waiting there to be fucking wooed. It's just that the end result of all of this, right? A man can actually go through his whole life and just fucking do what he likes in terms of, wives and children and this, that, and the other. Whereas for a woman to have a baby, it really is best done if you've got another fucking person there because it
Well,
is,
several people actually.
no shit, right?
Yeah. Right.
But I think maybe what isn't covered is how it is mentioned sometimes, but it isn't really as much that men who don't have that, who, great, enjoy your fucking life. But when you start to get older and, actually the loneliness kicks in, and actually everybody needs a kind of community around them. Loneliness is a real killer. And actually the easiest community to have or the, the most accessible is your family. And there are more reasons to, you know, fuck people than just for like those, that one night of fun. And also, if you do it an awful lot, you start to realize it's incredibly shallow and you actually become not a very nice person. You know, you actually do start, it blunts your empathy for whoever it is that you're hooking up with. You just think, yeah, 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 next. Who cares? There'll be another one along soon. So, and
Mhm.
that actually makes you a very shallow person, to not have experienced, I think you talk to anyone who's had children, and I'm not denigrating anyone who has chosen not to have children, not at all. But most people who have children end up at some point going, fuck me, I never knew I could have that level of self-sacrifice in me, or that depth of love, or that kind of, you know, concern and whatever preoccupation with another human being. You know what I mean? It's a very separate kind of thing. And I do think if you go through your life just shagging one partner after another and never really settling down, you're never really going to know how fucking rewarding that is to really have a life with someone and connect with them and feel that they're your kind of, you know, someone who really fucking understands you, who knows your past, who knows all your shitty secrets and still fucking loves you. My God, you know what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah, I'll share two stories with you quickly. And
Sure.
because you say so much in the book, I wouldn't normally want to say this publicly, so apologies, Dad. But so I found out when I was 45, right before my daughter was born, that my dad has five other kids. And so actually it was the day that I found out that my daughter's mom was pregnant. And I happened to be on my way to visit my dad. So I tell my dad, and so we're walking side by side. So I turn to him and I look him in the face and I say, "So you're telling me you have six children, none of whom are really in your life?" And he says, "Yes." And I just thought, man, this is a person who could have all these grandchildren bouncing on his knee, who could have all this love, right? And to my knowledge, my dad lives alone. He loves his solitude. He loves his opera. He loves his books. He loves his Shakespeare. And I'm just like, wow, you've come this close to creating a family, and you don't somehow you didn't draw it closer to you. And yeah, so that wasn't that long ago. And the other story,
Wow.
which is just as funny. My daughter's 6 now, but when she was like a baby and 2, she looked like a little boy. So all these people would come up to us and be like, "Oh, what an adorable little boy," and we would never correct them. And so they'd be like, "Oh, I bet he's gonna break a lot of hearts." But when they knew she was a girl, when it was more obvious she was a girl, nobody said that. They all said to me, "Oh, you're gonna have to get the shotgun." So it's like, wow, that's how. And women would say that to us. He's gonna break a lot of hearts. It's nobody ever said, "Oh, wow, your daughter's going to sleep with a bunch of, going to grow up and like be with a bunch of, have tons of boyfriends." Or so it's like, okay, that was kind of a clue from, I don't know what to make of it, but it was a clue. It was a big fucking clue, actually, that it starts early. And even moms want to picture their boys as having all these girls around them. So,
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, I have a friend actually. I remember when her boy was very little, she'd sort of go, yeah, he really hates pink. Like everything has to be blue or brown or whatever, but he really hates pink. And I kind of thought, are you saying this because this is somehow, you know, saying, oh, he's going to be a real man or something? And I did point out to her, I said, well, it's funny, isn't it? Because pink used to be a boy's color, you know.
yes. And blue was the girl's color. And then they switched it in like the
Exactly.
30s or something.
Exactly. And she was slightly appalled. That's not true. And I said, it is actually. If you look it up, it's true. Like when they announced the birth of, I can't remember which royal, George the whoever the fuck, the Queen's dad. Yeah, it was the pink bow in the pram or whatever. But I mean, I do think that there's a kind of funnily enough, people who are like incredibly right on before they have children, boy, do they fucking switch, right? When they have kids, like they still totally fall for all that crap, right? And it's easy to see why, because you do want your child to just have the best and easiest part of life and have all those advantages. But and so, you don't want, and it sounds terrible, but I do think people are like, people do suddenly care if their child is going to be gay or whether they're going to, be a lesbian or whether they're going to be, not pretty enough or not good enough at sports or, all these fucking stupid stereotypical tropes that people think make you either sex, right? And it comes from a good place of just wanting them. Please don't let them suffer in any way at all. Don't let them get bullied. Don't let them be disadvantaged in whatever way that is. But I do think once the sort of steamroller gets underway and your child is going through life, I mean, there's no way they can be perfect. They're just going to have to go through shit. Whatever it is they go through, you probably won't see it coming anyway, right? Even if they're the cleverest kid in the class, they're then going to have to suffer the stigma of being the cleverest kid in the class, right?
Yeah, and
And
you're not going to control how they turn out. Like I've done a lot better once I've realized this is just who this person is. I can show examples and instill certain things, but dropping the wanting them to turn out a certain way is a huge relief. It's better for them, obviously, but like, look, this is a person. This is who they are. It's really, really important, I think, because so much of that comes from us wanting to overcompensate for what we didn't
yeah,
have or whatever. Yeah, yeah.
and also, but as a parent, you're learning the whole time, you know.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I did want to ask you a little bit about music before I let you go. Um, so, for those who have not read the book, one of the most tantalizing attractions is going to be how much you say about the relationships with Chris and with Emma. What if you were kind of, and now you can see how far I haven't read, right? If you were to kind of entice or to give people a sense of what they're in for, What would you say in with those relationships in particular?
Um, I mean, what I would say is that my aim with the book, right, was, or what I found myself most enjoying was writing about people that I'd had, experiences and relationships with, but writing about them and trying to make them as fully rounded as possible. Like I don't really actually read a lot of biographies and things like that. It's just I'm not actually that interested, partly because I often find the writing quite boring, actually. And whereas in fiction, I think when you in fiction get a character, it has to be a good character. It has to win you over. It has to be interesting and three-dimensional and multifaceted. And that is kind of what I was trying. I mean, I don't have the space, but I was trying to do that with the book. So it's not like, it's difficult with Chris because he died. And, you know, I didn't want I hate the idea of him being thought of as just, who he was in that last moment. And, oh, this tragic figure. He wasn't a tragic figure. He was a tragic figure for about a month before he did what he did, and then forever after. But prior to that, there was absolutely nothing tragic about Chris. He was a really funny, vibrant, hilarious, warm person. So I wanted to get, you know, some of that into the book, who he was, but without deifying him because he's died as this sort of, oh, look at this saintly person who we've lost. I was trying to make sure that you got the silliness of him and some of the moodiness of him and how we navigated our way through the band. And the same goes with Emma, I mean, I've fallen out with Emma, so we don't talk. But again, I'm no interest in painting her as some, you know, bitch who, was this, that, and the other, or do you know what I mean? Who is partly because it's not the truth, right? And it's also very boring to read that. You want to get some sense of who that person is. What is it that's actually funny about them? Now, obviously, I had to tread quite carefully in both of those instances because I don't want to upset Chris's family. I don't want to upset Emma unduly. You know, it was just trying to get across my relationship with those people and how they figured in my life. So, and a lot of the book is like that. It's more about, yes, there's events in there. Yes, of course, it's pinned to things that happened, but it's so much more about how it felt at the time, right? And, what kind of emotions were going on, what kind of conflicts, what kind of friendships, what kind of fun, what kind of, you know, difficulties, none of which would have been obvious from the outside, right? And maybe the hook is that whatever you think, you may see an interview or you may have heard about us going on whatever tour. That's not what that book is about. It will mention that we went on that tour, but there will be stuff in there that is incredibly private to me, or was until I wrote this bloody book. And, also slightly under embargo because it's quite difficult being in a band. You've got a public profile to keep and people don't, probably if I'd have said half the things that I put in the book at the time, you know, everyone's fragile egos would have, not really, although a bit of me thinks maybe I should have done, maybe we would have avoided some of the problems. But, the point is that I do my best to try and make the teenage Emma, the 20s, Chris Acland sort of come across as a fully rounded human being.
Hmm. So, I mean, that's pretty powerful because I was going to ask you how much you saw signs ahead of time, but you're saying it was only a month. I mean, in your best estimation, what is it that could drive someone to that extreme in such a short window who didn't have, because people's assumption now is, oh, someone must have a predisposition towards depression or suicidal ideation, and you're saying that's not the case. So, I mean, why was that month so impactful?
Um, I mean, to be honest with you, I have sat around, know, certainly after Chris died, I must have spent 5 years sitting around with people talking endlessly about the possibles and the whys and the wherefores. And there are, several different strands. You could argue that, I remember going to Chris's funeral and they were like, oh, there is sort of, there have been suicides in the family before and there was depression on blah, blah side. But you think, okay, you're talking about some great uncle, right? Your family's fucking massive. I'm not being funny, but there's like shitloads of cousins and brothers and sisters. Like, I just don't really buy it. There's the fact that he was turning 30, oh, well, that's a kind of, really difficult age for men and blah, blah, blah. I get that. And I do think there's some truth to, Chris feeling like, he joined this band in his, he's 21 or whatever. We were at college and you get to 30 and you're starting to think, well, this is people are settling down, people have got mortgages, people, maybe I made the wrong choice. Maybe I should have gone back to the Lake District and worked at my dad's, paper mill or something, and I'd be in a more secure position. But we all go through that shit. Do you know what I mean? I think that these are all, none of it adds up to enough, right? There's no one thing. Yes, all right, your girlfriend dumped you, whatever. Do you know what I mean? It's not like you were going out for like 10 fucking years. Do you know what I mean? You've been going out for what? Less than a year. You were away for most of that. I mean, the band, the exhaustion. I mean, that Britpop era, a lot more drugs around. That didn't fucking help. I can tell you that. Um, you know, there's there's so many things that each one of which you can sort of go, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be the other. But none of them really add up to that because I've known people, including myself, who have gone through all of those little bits of shrapnel that stick in you. And not for a second, you know, would I have seriously considered doing something like that? And it literally was so out of the blue. I mean, I can actually remember Tim Freeze Green, the guy who produced Sweetness and Light, because I had to let everyone know before it got into the fucking press. And I was leaving messages everywhere and I was telling people, you have to call me back, you have to call me back. And Tim, I remember Tim leaving a message on my aunt's phone. He said, like, well, clearly someone's died. It's not you. And he told me afterwards, he said, like, Chris was literally the last person I thought I actually thought, well, there's no way it's Chris, right? So I don't know what's happened to either Emma or Phil, right? But it's definitely not Chris. And that's how everybody felt. Everyone could not believe it, right? And I do actually, it sounds sort of almost ridiculous to say, it sounds like you're making it up. But I do say to people, think of the last person on earth, right? Think of one of your friends and think, who's the one who you would say definitely won't do that? Well, that's what it was like, you know.
Hmm. Hmm. I remember reading in Spin magazine. It's not online, at least that I could find. This has to have been 20 years ago. There was a column, like a list of different people who'd been in bands and how they had adjusted, like what they did after leaving music. And both you and DJ Yella from NWA said that losing a band member completely took your desire for music. It just died with both of you said similar things actually. And then you told a story about how you had gotten some like straight job in an office, and then the lady like who was working above you or something, your supervisor or whatever, was like, it's not gonna do for you to show up to turn up hungover late and hide under your desk or something like that. But it took a long time for you to even be open to music again. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's arguable that I was already in not a good place, even without what happened to Chris. I think I was already kind of really wrung out with being in the band and just because the landscape around us had completely changed, the whole music industry and the way it operated and all the people who were there who were our kind of people at the beginning, they were gone. Ivo was gone, Tim from Warner's was gone. We were kind of, and also that it was getting harder and harder. We were all turning 30. the music business had become, independent music was just kind of vanishing in front of our eyes. And I think because 1996 was this like this sort of, guillotine came down. Now that I've, talked to a lot of other people who were in bands that, Ride or Slow Dive, but I didn't, My Bloody Valentine, all of these bands split up not long after, you know what I mean? All around the same time because the industry had changed. And I do actually wonder, even if we'd stuck at it and made another record, I'm not even sure that we wouldn't have got dropped because we just weren't making the kind of music that was being demanded. And it was all very driven by major labels then, it was all about money, it was all about chart positions. So I think it would have kind of it would have probably happened anyway. But I think with, what, Chris dying, it just made it wasn't so much that I just, wasn't enjoying it. It just made it unbearable. Like I remember trying to go to gigs and I just would just start crying, I just couldn't function. And I got to a point where I thought, this isn't, first, it does, I don't know. I don't think it's uncommon for people when they lose, when they have a death of someone close to them, it kind of shifts all their relationships around. They end up kind of, ditching a lot of people because my feeling was like, fuck me, I spent all this time on all these people who mean nothing to me. And Chris is gone, who meant everything to me. And it just pales. Like it actually annoys me having to be around these people because they're not Chris, right? And they are no substitute. And also, I just thought, well, this is not the place to bring all your emotional baggage. It's a gig. People want to enjoy themselves and have chit chat. You just can't expect that of people. And it just became too painful. And I really, really need, I did kind of have people going, oh, why don't you get when I started doing sub editing, oh, you should work, you should try and get a job at the NME or at a music paper. And I thought, no, no, I don't want anything to do with it. People are like, oh, maybe you should go into production. Or I thought, no, none of it. I don't want any of it because every time I fucking venture into that world, all I can see is this gaping hole where Chris used to be. And I need to go somewhere where he's just, he's always part of me, but it isn't a fucking, like it doesn't feel like a lack. This can never be as good because Chris isn't here, right? And when we did the reunion, which was 20 years later, I was still worried about that. I was still thinking, how's it going to be when I'm standing on stage and I turn around and it's not Chris there, but it's Justin, right? Now, as it happens, it was absolutely fine. I had a brilliant time. Justin was great. And, I was, nowhere near as fragile as I thought I would be, but it took a lot for me to actually just even want to go back there because I just, it was seismic. It still makes me tear up a bit when I think about it.
Yeah. So there's that guitar beginning to the song Deluxe, that arpeggio or whatever you'd call it, that na 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 na. Man, it's like goddamn. It's like a gust of the past, just of or from that time period. I mean, and it's almost strong enough to like feel like it might knock me over, right? And it's quite wonderful, but it's also bittersweet. And I think you could feel that from the crowd. Like I've heard live recordings where you'd start playing that and the room would just go, people would feel. What was that? What kinds of feelings did those songs stir up for you? Getting to play them again.
Um, I have quite an odd relationship, I think. Well, I don't know how common this is, but I don't really listen to my own music after it's been recorded.
It's pretty common, actually. A lot of musicians say only when they have to learn them to play them live.
Yeah,
That they close
exactly.
the book on it right when it's done because they've done it so much to make it, heard it so much
Exactly.
to create it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that possibly the impact it has on me, like there's been times where I've been somewhere and a song one of our songs has started playing, and it's taken me like a few seconds to realize that it's actually Lush, right? Because I think, oh, what's this? And I go, oh, fuck, it's us. Like, and I think when I hear it in that context, it's sort of, I mean, it's a bit like seeing a photograph from your past, you know what I mean? It just feels nostalgic. I can never really judge the music that we made as music. It's impossible. Way too embedded in it. If I listen to it like that, all I can hear is the mistakes, my mistakes, right? Oh, I wish I'd have done that, or I should have done that bloody backing vocal again. Or, you know what I mean? It's all the
Mhm.
flaws that I hear. If I hear it in that kind of unexpected way, it's just nostalgia. It does sort of bring back kind of, you know, sort of little visual flashes of being in a rehearsal room or, being on a tour bus or something. It is like a sort of, it's quite filmic, actually. I suddenly remember kind of, where I, you know, where I was then, you know, how I felt then. It feels like suddenly it's like a different person inhabits you. It is quite odd. But I think um like actually playing the songs, weirdly, there've been songs that I've actually found like quite moving or touching emotionally, and I actually have to fucking suppress that because you can't start getting all wobbly in the middle of a song. It's like, so I actually have to sort of try and pretend they're just words, words, words. Stop thinking about what the song is about.
You mean more so in 2016 than back when you originally made them?
I think even then, because I think there's a kind of something about things that when they catch you by surprise, because it sounds really terrible, doesn't it? Sort of going, oh yeah, I wrote this song, and every time I hear it, it just moves me to tears. That's so self-indulgent. But I think sometimes it's like, it's like, I'm going to use a really stupid analogy here, but I don't know if you've ever read the Hitchhiker's Guide books.
Nope.
There's a particular spaceship that you can only see if you're not looking at it. You have to be caught by surprise to see it. And it's a bit like that with the music sometimes. Like suddenly you're sort of playing it, and then you suddenly get this memory of where it came from. But you know, if you sit there and think about it and analyze it, it doesn't affect you at all. But every now and again, if I sing a song or I hear, that if I was having to play a song, and sometimes they would be Emma's because I would find her songs really moving. So even if they're not my lyrics, but I have to sing them, there'd be this little pang, you know what I mean, that would of emotion.
Hmm. That relationship with Emma was always um there was always a contrast, right, in your makeups, your personalities. When did it become like when did the friction really start?
I mean, if I'm completely honest, it was probably there right at the beginning,
Hmm.
when we were at school together. We are quite different people. And, I mean, it's difficult because I don't talk to her anymore. So it's not something that we can discuss. And then you have a kind of one-sided conversation where you're just, going in directions that if the other person was there, could disagree with you and make you think about it a bit more. But, there's a bit of me that thinks, a lot of my friendship with Emma was, I mean, circumstantial, like a lot of friendships are. We both had quite a lot of freedom compared to our friends who were at school. So we were both only children. So, we were more at a loose end and wanting company than some of our other friends. And we had the freedom to do that. And also our relationship, you know, we had, she had quite a difficult relationship with her parents, and I think we kind of, I certainly had a lot of sympathy with her, whereas I think, sometimes the way that Emma would act around her parents, like other friends of ours would be like, oh my God, that's really bad. Whereas I kind of thought, well, I kind of get it, so I don't think I ever judged her on that at all. I had total sympathy with her. So that, and there was, on one side, I think we riffed off each other really well. I was probably more reckless in a way, but Emma had a lot of she's kind of, she's not easily swayed. You know what I mean? She's quite, whereas I am,
Mm.
she doesn't really suffer from that kind of, bad influences and, doing things she doesn't know if she wants to do. She most of the time she knows what she wants to do. And that was quite useful for me a lot of the time. But I do think that whereas I am someone who was quite needy, actually, quite clingy and, craved, kind of, I was probably swamped her a bit, with my needs. Emma was kind of the opposite and could, sometimes I was shocked by how cold she could suddenly be towards me. And I think that kind of relationship, while not unusual at all, was possibly a source of a lot of the kind of, problems that we had between us. Um, just, ultimately very different needs. And I do question, I think that, when we were at school together, we started going to gigs. When we were 17, we did the fanzine. That kind of tied us together because it was like a project. I sort of almost look at it like so much of our life was a working relationship. It was the fanzine, then it was setting up the band, and then once the band got going, you can't really get away from each other. And not only can you not get away, but you are spending an awful lot of time with each other. And there's I felt, I suppose, I can only speak from my perspective. I think that I felt that there were times when Emma just shut me out, and I thought that was really unfair, and it upset me. And I don't think I really knew how to cope with that. And I found myself feeling that I'm here when I'm needed to mop up all the crap. And when Fun Emma comes out and it's all going great, then I'm just expected to fuck off, you know what I mean, and not cramp her in any way at all. So, from my perspective, that's how it felt. And so I just felt I was treading on eggshells a lot.
Mm.
I probably resented that.
And so what can you say about what happened after 2016? Why that seemed unexpected that there was another like there was an actual fallout, and that was the reason why the band didn't continue further past that point. Or at least that's not what you initially said in your statement, but then later it was revealed, and that's the impression I got later, that it was like, well, that was the thing that kind of um, prevented it from going further.
Yeah. I mean, it was a proper falling out.
So, I mean, how much was it on the table that there might have been more new material in the pipeline had that survived? Had the whole reunion
Um,
kept going?
I mean, the tricky thing was with the reunion was that I was actually in a job, like a full-time job. But what coincided was I had like, because I'd been in the job for 5 years, the company I worked for, they gave you like a sabbatical that you could, take or not take. It was kind of, but it was paid leave. So I could add that to all my holiday and take quite a significant chunk of the year out, certainly enough to go on tour in America a couple of times and to do all the rehearsals and stuff. But I was, in between like doing that, I was back to the day job and working all day. So it was always going to be limited because I was, very clear that I cannot lose that job. I was the main breadwinner in the family. The kids were still quite small. There's no way I'm losing that fucking job, right? So it was never going to be like, oh, you know, if it takes off, I can give up work and we can just do Lush forever. So that was never going to be on the cards. And the time it would have taken to record like a whole album. I mean, initially when we were working with Jim and Daniel uh, to do the Blind Spot EP, initially there was talk of doing an album, but it was like, oh my God, I mean, that's, oof, I don't know if we've got the time, so we made it an EP. I mean, there's a possibility that if things had gone really well, that we could have done an album afterwards, that I could have done it with, you know, recording. in between times. But I just think I just wonder whether that would have just been putting off something that would have ended up becoming a real problem because there's I wasn't going to give that job up.
Mm,
I
mm.
know, for there's a million people around you when you embark on these reunions and God knows what. There's a load of people telling you how much fucking money you're going to make and oh yeah, you're going to be giving up your job in 6 months' time because it's going to be amazing. Well, I fucking had a lifetime hearing that bollocks, and that's not how it works.
Mm.
So I think even if we had done an album, if it had then come up like, well, we want to go on tour, I would have had to go like, well, I'm sorry, I've got like, 6 days holiday left and I want to fucking see my kids.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
probably would have been the end of it.
So, but hearing you talk about it though, I mean, the response was so positive. I would think it had to give some closure or some um, give you some satisfaction that your life's work had up, with Lush. I mean, that you had left an imprint that maybe wasn't as obvious to you in '96 in the haze of all that of breaking up and Chris dying,
For
right?
sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it
Because
was I think 20 years later, I think people were, I tell you what, I have told this anecdote before, but there was a real sort of moment when I saw like a sea change because I think it was actually before the reunion, but I think someone wrote like a 20th anniversary of whatever the fuck, spooky or whatever, right? In maybe it was in the quietest. And it was this very kind of, lots of praise, someone who actually said, oh, I actually preferred Lush to My Bloody Valentine, and this is why, and was a fan, and, wrote this lovely piece and cited all these different areas like Grail Marcus and all these writers who had really loved our work and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it went up. And the minute it went up, it was on the 1st of April, right? And immediately, all the fucking, people were up there like, oh, it's fucking April Fool's Day, isn't it? Like, Lush was shit, la, la, la. Key amongst them was a journalist who was actually a contributor to the Quietus. So he was right up there slagging us off. And then it just took a little bit of time and America started to wake up and suddenly there were all these comments from people like, oh, I loved Lush. They were amazing. And it was totally like full on like positive comments. So that even this fucking journalist who'd slagged us off up in the comments early on came back in and was going, oh, I was only kidding. I thought Lush were great. And I thought, yeah, fuck you. Like, but I do think actually, for all the sort of ills of social media, I think Lush is a band that got kind of reclaimed and re-established because of social media, because the press certainly weren't going to do it. And actually, I think that although there were journalists who were really supportive of Lush, they were often shouted down, And I think that having that kind of wave of, you know, lots of bands who got into like shoegaze and started shoegaze bands who were citing us. And, you know, that really kind of, I don't know, it sort of redrew our legacy. And I think that I was worried before doing the tour. I think we all were, that, does it look like we're cashing in? Is it going to kind of spoil things if we reform? Does it feel a bit sort of lame? But actually, the gigs were great. It was so much fun to play music again. And it was such a great response that, it actually rekindled it for me. It's why I've not stopped doing music since. So I'm incredibly grateful that that tour happened.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you between Chris dying and that, how much had you even um, toyed around with music at all? Maybe with Moose at home, privately, whatever, in
I
that
mean, I
whole.
got asked to do a couple of things. I did a couple of vocal bits and pieces when I was asked as a favor. That was fine. I think. I mean, me and Moose were, you know, no, fucking hell, once you've got children, you know what I mean? It's like very difficult and full-time jobs, it's difficult to make the time. And I think the other thing is I'm not very good at self-motivating. I didn't, even the book. I had to be asked to do that, and I had to lose my job, and it had to be lockdown, where I thought, well, I fucking can't get a job now, so I might as well do this bloody book. And Peter keeps hassling me to do it, so okay, fuck it, why not, you know? And I think a lot of the driver for Lush even getting off the ground was, you know, it was Emma who had the ambition and who, you know, really wanted to take it, you know, I mean, I didn't think for a second we'd get signed to a label like 4AD, but she had a lot more sort of self-belief about those sort of things. And with the reunion again, you know, I was a bit like, well, who the fuck cares about Lush, you know? And she was like, well, I think you need to have a look at social media. There's quite a lot of people who are kind of into it. And, you know, it was really that she wanted to do it. You know, there's no way, like, all I can say is there's no way it would have come from me going to Emma. How do you feel about reforming Lush? Right? There's just no way. And I'm not saying that as a kind of like a bad thing. You know, it's always been Emma who had the kind of the real drive for those things. And I've always needed someone else. You know, PIROSHKA, really, it was Justin who was like, come on, you've got to do something else after this. You're back in music now. Come on, we should do something. So I've always relied on other people. You know, once I'm in the
What about
saddle, I will do the work and I will fucking, you know, absolutely, you know, put the shift in. But actually getting it off the ground and having that self-belief, that's not really my thing.
but wait a minute. So even MB3 is not is the same. Is that the same situation there? Like even with MB3
Yeah.
with Moose and Ollie, you're still okay. Okay.
Pretty
So
much because we formed just because I was doing book talks and they were like, can you do some music? And and I was like, well, not on my own. So Moose and Ollie, we were like, you know, Moose said, well, we could do it. Three of us could do it, you know. So we started playing a few Lush songs. And then, you know, it's actually Moose who was going, you know, we should do this. We should carry on with this. We could write stuff because he, you know, really enjoyed working with Ollie as well. And it was, and then we got asked to support the wedding present, and then we got asked to support the Gang of Four, and then this American thing came up. So it's actually me being like pulled along by the momentum again. So yeah, no, it's not like I've been sitting here ever since PIROSHKA thinking, right, what's next? What's next for Miki in music? No
hmm,
fucking idea.
hmm. When did you feel like Lush had arrived at its own sound? Because obviously Robin Guthrie producing uh, Spooky, um, you know, always talked about in the in the same breath as all these other shoegaze quote unquote shoegaze bands. Um, when was when did you and or Emma feel like okay, we've got our signature?
I just don't think I really thought about it that objectively.
Mm,
You know, I think, you know, maybe Emma did. Um, I always felt, you know, for me, everything was a bit, and this isn't a criticism, it is how I do everything. It was just you're in the moment. Okay, I'm gonna write a song. There we go. This is how the song comes out. The song comes out the way it comes out because these are our limitations. This is the only way I can sing. This is the only way we can play guitar. This is the producer we're working in with, you know. This is, you know, it's not like we sat down and go, do you know what? The next time we do an album, I want this. This is what I want the sound to be. This is what we're aiming for. It was always just about the songs and then seeing, you know, who could bring something different to them production wise, you know. And and I think we just rely, yeah, we just kind of, you know, we got better at playing because we played a lot of shows. It was always quite organic, really. You know, it's not like we sat there and thought, right, next one's going to have like, you know, orchestral this on it or blah, blah, blah. It would just individually come up as we were doing the songs. I mean, I think some song, again, it would be the songs. You know, I do remember Emma going, oh, I think this would be really good with some strings on it, you know, when we record it and blah, blah, blah. But we weren't really, I don't think we really thought that much, you know, beyond the immediate. You know, we weren't kind of, I don't know, we didn't look at other bands and go, oh, we want to sound like that, or we want, you know, this sort of. It felt like it all just sprang from the songs and how we interpreted and played them, you know. So that
Because I
was
mean, you
really our
didn't.
signature.
Because I mean, you didn't really consider yourselves even musicians at first, in the sense that you have said. I think you and Emma maybe. I'm not 100% sure on that, but have said that you saw other bands sound checking. And you're like we couldn't do that. We could only play our own songs. Or you saw other bands jamming in some ideas in sound check, and you're like, no, we right. And so I'm just wondering where along the way it started to feel like, no, no, we are able to craft. We are we've honed our craft.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll be honest with you. I have always said, we weren't a jamming band, and I do say we weren't good enough to jam, and I do mean that. We also didn't fucking want to jam, right? Just looks boring to me, like a load of people just fucking wanking off eternally, until something comes along that might be usable. Just sit down and write the fucking song. You know what I mean? To me. Now, that's a blunt way of putting it. Clearly, there are bands that come up with remarkable stuff by doing it that way, but it just doesn't interest me. And it didn't interest Emma either. You know, for us, it was about, the song is in your head, you're crafting it. And I mean, there are times when I could have done with more collaboration because I do think it was a lot to have to write, the entire song, the drum pattern, the bass part, the backing vocals, Emma's guitar solo, the whole fucking lot, I could have done with a little bit more kind of bleed across. But actually, I have that now, so PIROSHKA songs, MB3 songs. I mean, there's an irony that it's called Miki Berenyi Trio, which is pure branding because it's actually an incredibly collaborative band. So if Moose writes a song, I can add the backing vocals, I can change the lyrics, we can all work together on how the backing track is going to sound and all of that. But the song always starts, it doesn't start with three of us now in a rehearsal room, just seeing what we come up with. It's still songs written. Here you go. Here's the song, right? And then we go from there.
Yeah, so I mean, because it's you've said this before, but it was very much you wrote your songs, Emma wrote her songs, and you kind of had to almost the impression I got was like force each other's styles to like it. People think of Lush as like, oh, there's like these intertwining vocal harmonies and intertwining guitar parts, and so they were able to mesh their two styles together quite beautifully. But that's not. It doesn't seem like that's actually what happened, or it happened by.
I mean, it happened by necessity because um, we'd all be playing on the songs and therefore, you know, that's how it came out. But I think that there was, I mean, I think Robin Guthrie actually had some quote somewhere where he was talking about recording Spooky with us. And he had actually, it might have been in that 4AD book. I think there was some comment where he said, well, basically, they had ideas that were way beyond their abilities. And, that's definitely true. Emma I remember that song, Tiny Smiles, and I couldn't even fucking find the note. I was trying to pitch against, like, I didn't even know what I'm doing. You know what I mean? It was just hit and miss the whole time. And just not within, it's not like she wrote that song thinking, oh, I know what your vocal style is, so I've written this song for you. It's like, no, I've written this song and you're just going to have to fucking find a way to sing it, right? And in some ways, that is good. You do want to be stretched. You don't just want to keep doing the same fucking thing all the time. But sometimes it was kind of, it was quite hard work. But Chris had that when we did Sweetness and Light, Tim Freeze Green sat there in that. And Chris is a great drummer, but my God, the discipline of doing the drums for Sweetness and Light. And they sounded amazing. It was totally worth it. But he was in hell, right? Poor old Chris was like, oh God, I feel like such a shit drummer because he keeps telling me to do it again, 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 again. And I just think, there's always a kind of where you fall in, things that are too much, things that push you and are good, that's the whole experience of it, really. And I think that when I sit there and I say, well, we just weren't very good musicians, my problem is that like people go, oh, but don't you love your voice? You've got I love your voice. It's so great. And I think, no, I don't love my voice. But I have quite probably have like quite a high benchmark. So I think this it's fine. There's lots of people in bands whose voices are just okay. It's great because they're part of that band and that's what you associate that band with. So it means something to you. But I don't think most people have got great voices. You know, there's a handful of great voices. And I'm certainly not one of them. But I don't have a fucking problem with that. I just think, and people think that I'm being denigrating to myself, but I would say the same about a shitload of other singers. I won't say them here because it sounds rude, but I just think, who thinks that of themselves? You know, unless you're Liz Fraser or fucking David McCormon or someone who you go, wow, fucking hell, come on, you know, league apart. I mean, most of us are just, you know, yeah, great, well done. You can carry a tune, you know, and then
Hmm.
you have a distinctive voice because that's, I quite like untrained voices. You know, they have a charm. Um, you know, I don't want to hear just glossy, perfect vocals. So, you know, I don't have a problem with it, but I'm certainly not going to sit here and say I'm a fucking amazing musician and a great singer when I'm not.
Hmm. Last question for you. You were talking before about the changing. Um, there's definitely a sense by 1996 that the moment has passed, both for that quote unquote shoegaze crop of bands, but also for grunge too, quote unquote. Right? I mean, it's like a cleaver. It just um, and I was surprised to find out that Love Life actually was quite successful, at least in the UK, and had
Yeah.
sold well. But the morale of the band was still, Emma was about to leave, was talking about leaving. There was morale issues. You touched on this a little bit earlier. The book is subtitled, How Music Saved Me from Success. What is your idea of success now versus what you would have thought in 96?
I mean, I think, you know, the problem with 1996 and that era is that, you know, what success was being mapped out for you. Now, I'm not saying that it wasn't before, but before it was a thing that people rejected. Independent music, people went, fuck that. I don't want to be on a major label. I don't want to play in a fucking stadium to a bunch of sheep. You know, I want to, yes, I'd like a bit more fucking money. That would be nice. But it was about, in an ideal world, what you wanted was for everyone else to realize what was great about that kind of music and fucking get on board with it. Not change your music so you can fit in with whatever, you know, some record company thinks is going to sell, which is actually what happened. You know, I think, you know, then you have to, you know, I don't know, like not do the thing that you actually want to do. And, you know, when Emma was wanting to leave the band, I just remember her saying, like, I haven't got it in me to write another love life. I just don't want to. I'm not interested in doing that. And I actually said at the time, fine, we can do something else. We can do anything, you know, might not get fucking released, but let's just do that. You know, I'm happy to do an album of fucking Gregorian chants if you want, you know, which was literally my words. And, you know, I would have been happy to do that, you know, because I think that by then it had become so much about, you know, I mean, credit to her, you know, Emma was like, why aren't we playing in Britain? Why aren't we playing in Europe? That's where the album's doing up. No, back to America, 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 because that's where, if you get successful in America, then that is it, right? That's the golden prize. But this album is not going to be successful in America. It will never happen. And I think for Emma, that was the kind of, I just can't do this anymore. I'm being told what I should want. And I don't want that thing, you know. And I don't think any of us did want it really. We, you know, the rest of us were a bit more sort of placid and were, you know, probably exhausted as well. Just thought, oh, well, I don't know, just tell us what to fucking do, you know what I mean? But I think I think that you know, whereas a label like 4AD being on 4AD previously, you know, it was about just, you know, really maverick. You know, the Cocteau Twins did some very strange albums, you know what I mean? Um, following big successes with quite obscure, kind of recordings. And they were given the freedom to do that on a label like 4AD. Well, the world was changing. Even a label like 4AD wasn't going to put out stuff like that anymore, and
Mm.
everyone was enthralled to the majors, and it kind of destroyed the independent scene. There wasn't anywhere to go. All that music just withered on the vine because there's no one there to support it. Everyone got a whiff of the cash, and they dropped everything in pursuit of that. That's the way I felt, you know. And so success then was defined in a way that I had always rejected, whether it was Ray and his Hollywood lifestyle, or whether it was, major labels in the early 1980s, which is why I got into independent music in the first place, you know, Live Aid, kind of all that sort of, super stuff. Not that I didn't like Wham and God knows what, but that was never the thing that I wanted. And suddenly that's all you can want. That's the only option. Otherwise, we're not even going to put your record out, right? There isn't even an option to do it a different way.
Yeah, so you're saying that for Love Life there was outside pressure and direction that guided the or determined the direction of that album that was coming from outside the band.
Yeah, it was well as the manager as well. And I get it. We've done well in America. I understand that, you know, for him to ignore that would have been a bit crazy. But I just think also even the whole tone of like playing those shows in America had changed. When we did Lollapalooza, I mean, I think I saw some recent interview with the Mary Chain where they said, oh, well, we were just not really wanted on that tour and nobody was interested in them. That's not true. I watched every show of theirs. Of course, they weren't as big as Pearl Jam, right? Okay, they didn't have the whole place being torn apart, but there were a lot of people there who fucking really enjoyed them. Okay, and there's plenty of people who even watch Lush. We were on first thing. Most of the people were there to see Pearl Jam, who were on right after us. But they did turn up. They didn't throw bottles of piss at us. They were perfectly fine. By the time in 1995 or six, when we're playing these kind of radio festivals in America, people are throwing shit, right? They're booing you because there's a bunch of guys at the front who just want to hear like, jock music, and they're not going to deal with like two, English girls with a 12-string guitar and whatever wafting vocals. They're completely intolerant. And any kind of, all I'm saying is that within a few years, that idea of independent music where people open. We went on tour with Babes in Toyland. We went on tour with Flaming Lips. We went on tour with Weezer. It didn't matter that the music wasn't exactly like ours. That was the point. It was great. You got to see two bands in one night who were so different from each other, but in spirit, have something in common. Huh? A few years later, no one's interested. They just want to hear the same fucking thing repeated 5 times on a stage, right? And
Yeah, I was gonna say the spirit in Love. I mean, actually, you played with Jane's Addiction also in the States
mm,
in 1991. But the spirit of that Lollapalooza bill, it was still very much in the air that, oh, this is a mixed bag. And yes, it was kind of ridiculous seeing the Jesus and Mary Chain pale and, you know, drugged up with sunshine. It's like, these are like the last people who look like they want to be in sunlight, right? But yeah, I mean, I was there. There was definitely a sense of like, let's all mix this together. And uh, although, because of the way these venues are designed in the States, the traffic jam was so fucking terrible on the way that I missed Lush and Pearl Jam, and I'm still pissed about that to this day. But I did see Lush with Jane's Addiction a year prior, and I think one of the problems that arose here was that this whole alternative, quote unquote, alternative grunge thing was never aimed at that level of success, but it achieved it almost by mistake. And then I think that sort of deranged the music industry. because I mean never mind, they printed 30,000 copies or something and they ran out by Christmas of 1991. They weren't thinking, okay, they just put it out and they're like, okay, this is, modest success, maybe this will sell 100,000. But then once it started going, then I think it warped. It's like, oh, Pearl Jam can be huge, Nirvana can be huge, all this stuff can be huge. And they just started trying, and then I don't know why it was so sudden, but then I remember all these music magazines, Britpop and electronica at the time was what they were calling it. And then even Pearl Jam records, Soundgarden records, Stone Temple Pilots, they all drastically dropped in sales in 1996. Like it was like they'd been selling like 5 million or whatever, and then down to one. So I still don't understand quite how that happened. I kind of feel like the music industry did it to itself. Whereas if they had just had more modest expectations, the whole thing could have kept afloat. Maybe. I don't know. Hearing you talk about it, I feel like somehow the success ruined everything. What's your take?
Um, I mean, I don't know. I think that I think it's quite tricky when you get to the level. The problem is it's maintaining it, right? If you have a hit, hurrah, well done, lucky you, you know what I mean? Or it's a fluke or whatever. Do you know what I mean? I don't for a second think that, Lady Killers is a better song than Deluxe just because it charted higher. That's the thinking that started to infiltrate, right? And I just think that like I don't and I would question whether half the people who have success actually get to enjoy it for very long because very quickly on the heels is how do you maintain that, you know? And usually the answer is do more of the same, right? Which is not what really anybody wants to hear who is creative, right? That's a fucking death knell. So, you know, although from the outside, you can be someone who like looks at someone's music and goes, well, it all sounds the fucking same to me. Like, do you know what I mean? But if you're a fan of that music, you know the difference between all of those albums. You know the difference between 17 seconds and fucking Japanese whispers or whatever, right? Even if to the untrained ear, it all sounds the fucking same. So I think it's just that idea of, suddenly all this, what you get is a small pool. I think that success is very tricky because I certainly don't think that I don't have enough of a self-belief or an ego to think that I could battle that, right? Once you're that successful, you have to get all these people in that is their main goal, right? Is the success. They don't really care what fucking music you make anymore, right? As long as it's successful. And I think that it's very, very hard to not sort of go for that bait, really hard, you know.
Hmm.
And I think it's been proven time and time again that it's not really manageable. Like, yes, okay, well done, Taylor Swift, you know, but for every Taylor Swift, there's like a fucking million musicians who either turned away before they got anywhere near that and thought, no, thank you very much. It's already turned to shit, or people who just got completely consumed by it and wrung out and spat out. So I don't think it's, you know, I'm trying to sort of have some pithy words of wisdom, but I don't really because I don't actually think about success that much because I just know that it's not something I can chase because it doesn't suit me. But partly because I don't know what, success tends to be another person's definition of what success is. It doesn't, you can sit there and kind of be like, well, my idea of success is having two children and a relationship. I don't know. You can build your own little sort of world of what it means to you, but that's completely irrelevant. It's most people think of success success as, certainly if you're a musician, is playing fucking stadiums, selling shitloads of records and being instantly recognizable, something approaching the Beatles or something, that's the benchmark.
Mm.
And I just don't think that's something that I'm in the least bit interested in, never mind able to achieve, not even interested.
Mm. I wonder how well you would have even coped with that had it accidentally happened or had it just happened to happen. Either way, whether it was the through doing the music that you were all feeling in your hearts or trying, if it had happened, one wonders how different, uh, how well you would have been able to land on your feet personally.
Not well at all. Not well at all, I suspect. I think I would have either become a total fucking monster. I was already a fucking pain in the ass a lot of the time, but I would have been completely out of control, or it would have completely crushed me and I would have gone the way of, various other tragic figures. Um, it's difficult for me to think that I would have had the strength of character to even be able to walk away from it and go, you know what, this isn't for me. I think it would have just consumed me in one way or another, you know.
How were you a total pain in the ass?
Um, I don't know. I think just probably too opinionated, loud-mouthed, you know, probably needed too much attention. Um, you know, like anyone, you get carried away, you know. It's sort of fun and then it isn't, and you find yourself, it's quite difficult to see where the tipping point comes, but you sort of find yourself turning into, I mean, maybe part of it is because there's only so much, right, that you can do. Okay. There's only so many people you can fuck and drinks you can drink and friends you can make and attention you can have, right? Like there's a point where it's just enough, okay? And because actually your shift into that means you are totally not looking after a side of yourself that also needs nurturing. You do have to be self-sufficient. You do have to be able to have quiet time. You do have to wrestle with, your own demons or think about your behavior or your life. And that's not because you've done anything terrible, but that's just a normal part of life, right? If you just have a shitty day at work, you need to process that and think about it. And in that world, there isn't really much time to think about it because first of all, there's always someone there to tell you that, oh, no, no, but you're amazing, right? Which is just really unhealthy. And to excuse you, to kind of, and also to feed your insecurities. And, a big part of, one of the pressures of being in a band is there's always people trying to muscle into what they see as this little unit and split you apart a bit so they can kind of, wedge a shoulder in through the door. And that often means pitting people against each other, I mean, not that I ever had this, but I've seen bands where, managers or labels are like, oh yeah, but you're the important one to the singer or whoever the fuck. You know what I mean? And and it's a band. It's never going to be as good as if you keep that band together. But so there's all this sort of shit that goes on. And I think there's a point where being that rootless, constantly traveling, having this one thing occupy all your time. I mean, God, if most people have a job, right? And I know people with really stressful jobs, like, head teachers and things like that. It's not good for you when a job takes up every waking moment of your life, however fucking fun it seems to be. It's not healthy, you know? And I just think that, you know, I don't think I would have coped with it very well. I didn't have a strong enough, um, no, I don't know what it is. Probably maybe a bit like my dad, this is what I want. I want the marriage, I want the children, and then it's like, oh, look over there. Shit, I don't want to miss out on that, which is not a good personality to have when you're surrounded by those sort of temptations, self-destructive ones.
Hmm. I think one of the worst things about it that I've noticed just from observing and talking to musicians, it does not seem like a good thing to have people put in a position where all they're ever fucking talking about is this thing they created and themselves relative to this thing, and everyone is coming to them talking about that thing, the band. Like if you listen to like somebody in Metallica, like since the age 18, been that's all that's ever been asked of them to present to the, and it's like completely flattens a person into like a wax statue or something.
Well, and funny enough, I think we've come full circle because it does make me think of children. That idea, I get it, oh, we want our children to succeed. We want them to be amazing. Oh, you're amazing. You're good. You could do anything. You could become whatever you want. No, you fucking can't. And I think children sometimes, it crushes them, that kind of expectation. It's not healthy for them. They need to know that there's shit that they can't do. No, it's bedtime, right? Fuck off. The grown-ups are talking. Shh, right? You know, and I just think that, maybe that is, the thing, when you get into that world and with that success, everybody thinks that all you want to talk about is yourself. So that's what they feed back to you. They think that you just want praise. They think that, so you're just getting, this kind of, very skewed idea of what the world is. And it makes you very vulnerable, actually. You wouldn't survive 5 minutes outside it. And I see that with small children, who literally cannot, their ego cannot take any kind of, failure, as they see it, or disappointment. Very small children, I totally understand that. It's a natural response. Small children do not like to fail. They get angry, they have tantrums. But that's what growing up is that you get that kind of eked out of you because you realize it's fine. There's other ways to be happy than just being the winner all the fucking time, right? And I think
Yeah,
that
and
that kind of success, makes you infantile in that same way.
right. And I also have wondered whether, because you think about rock stars destroying hotel rooms and stuff, which I find really boring and obnoxious and stupid, but I can see where someone in that position is almost wanting people to say no, is acting out so that people do say no to them finally, and nobody ever does.
For sure, for sure. Yeah. And again, there's a fine line, isn't there, between adventure and, there's no doubt there's a kind of thrill of like, oh, let's do something fucking crazy just because we feel like it. And you probably will remember that for the rest of your life and go, that was a fucking wild, whatever the fuck it was. Do you know what I mean? Every now and again, but that you're right, it's because you're breaking those boundaries. Got away with it once. If you make a fucking habit of it and that's your life, now it's not good. Now it's every
Right.
day.
How familiar are you with the Radiohead documentary Meeting People is Easy, where it starts with them being interviewed and they're completely like not into, and they're just like shriveling at all this attention, because we were talking about this before, being interviewed, and that film starts with them and they're just like, oh my God, like hour after hour being peppered with all these questions. I'm just curious how much, whether you've seen the film or how much you can relate to it.
I haven't seen the film actually. um, how much can I relate to it?
I just love it because they make fame look like not fun the whole time. It seems like you walk out of the theater like, my goodness, fuck that.
I mean, I think it depends. You know, this. I think with a band, there's extra on top of it. You don't know what's going on between them. You don't know whether one of them wants to say something, but they know it's going to piss the others off. And that doesn't have to be some terrible thing. It can be like, I mean, I've had situations where I've said something in some interview and I've thought, oh yeah, that was quite funny, and then been berated afterwards and told, can you not say that? Because it's actually really fucking annoying. And you think, right, fucking hell, I won't fucking say anything then. I mean, there's that kind of vibe as well. I mean, I think some people just don't really like talking to people. There is that. They like to choose who they talk to. I mean, I'll fucking talk to anyone. I talk to people on the bloody bus, and I'm going off to Golders Green. But like some people really don't, and it makes them feel awkward and they're being asked quite personal questions and they don't want to fucking talk about it with someone they've never fucking met before. Do you know what I mean? So there's all
Mhm.
sorts of reasons why an interview can be, and especially because, it's one thing if you're an actor, I think. Although actors have the same problem, don't they? I mean, I think when your profession is sort of quite public facing, people expect you to just be able to snap into performance mode at a moment's notice. And not everyone is like that. A lot of musicians are musicians because they kind of hide behind their music. That's part of the reason they do it is because that creates a barrier. I mean, in fact, most performers, if I think about it, because there's an awful lot of comedians who seem incredibly personable on stage, and then when they're off, it's like, whoa, fucking hell, you know what I mean? So I think, yeah, I wouldn't judge an entire mood on interviews, bands being interviews, because it can come out in many different ways, but all sorts of reasons.
Well, I would recommend the film though. It's really really
Okay.
funny in ways. It's just like from the opening shot, it's just like you just feel claustrophobic. It's not like these rock movies that like glamorize that whole lifestyle. It seems fucking suffocating, and that was intentional. But I was like laughing about it the whole time. Is it true that Ice Cube was upset that you wrote in lipstick, that you guys wrote something in lipstick on his dressing room mirror during Lollapalooza?
Yeah, well, first of all, I wrote it. I don't want the rest of the band to take any blame for that. I was just being friendly. I literally was like, hey, we've got two porter cabins with an adjoining door. Come and say hi, and have some of our beer and we can chat. And I mean, I was already pissed out of my mind by then, so I was like off somewhere. But I think when I came back, like a couple of the people who were in that dressing room when their kind of whole posse arrived were like saying, oh, there were some murmurs of like disrespecting and blah blah blah. They didn't seem very happy about it, and I was like, really? Oh, right, fuck it then. I mean, what the fuck am I supposed to do? Do you know what I mean? I was just trying to be friendly.
So that never, so then you never, so what were the encounters like from then? How much
I mean,
interaction did you have?
they didn't really hang out with us. I think, like I put it in the book. I mean, Chris, I remember there was one guy with them who had like a Scotland football shirt on. He was very sweet, actually. I think I might have chatted to him for a bit. But to be honest, a lot of them were just quite unapproachable. They were very young. I do remember when we were crossing over into Canada and we had like a kind of sheet with all the fucking hundreds of personnel and everything, and it had everyone's date of birth. And I thought, fuck me, some of them are only like 18 or 20, they're very young. And, they had their kind of image to upkeep or whatever. So, I mean, I think they were probably friendly with some of the guy bands. I have no idea. They didn't really pay much attention to us. So
Hmm.
whatever. I did try. You know, what can I say?
All right. Well, thank you for speaking so long.
Yeah, it was lovely to chat.
My
And
pleasure.
where did you say you were? Oh, you're in New York, aren't you?
I'm in Rochester, New York. Yeah, I'm in the same city as I dropped out of college twice from, but that's the same
Ah,
college. It's the same university that I discovered Gala. I came here in 1990, and Gala was in the radio station here. I can remember the way that radio station, the scent of old cardboard and vinyl in that radio station, and when that CD came, and I heard it, and here we are.
and here we are,
Yeah,
35 years later almost. Yes,
right,
that's slightly
right.
terrifying. Yeah.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Well, again, thanks again for going so long, and I'm excited, and I will read more of the book before writing my introduction.
Cool. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Likewise.
Cheers.
Okay, take care.